I mean, the joke fast fashion is literally right there. Fashion is obsessed with Formula One right now. What started as Lewis Hamilton's outfits getting papped in the paddock is now a full-blown cottage industry that every brand wants to take for a spin. Drivers are being offered increasingly high-profile roles within brands. One of the biggest fashion houses just signed a major investment deal, and more brands are casually signing up to the 10-team sponsorship list than you can count. Listen, okay, I'm not a Formula One expert and I'm not going to pretend to be, but I can Google and cite my sources, and I do consider myself somewhat of an expert in certain areas of fashion. And I think we need to put those two things together and talk about the relationship currently forming between big fashion and big oil, in what feels like the latest in a long line of fashion's hypocrisies. Except this time, it's brands going from sustainability strategies to funding a sport with direct ties to some of the worst polluters on the planet, and trying to convince us it's super cool in the meantime. Before we get into this, welcome back to the channel. Subscribe if you're new here and like hearing about all the ways fashion sucks and how we should be fixing the industry. So, okay, I'm not going to bore you by going into a 10-minute long rant about how cars go in a circle if, like me, you're not really into Formula One. But there is one thing you need to know. Formula One is big time bankrolled by oil and gas companies. And despite the many headlines they've recently put out about trying to make the sport more eco-friendly, it doesn't seem willing to cut ties with these funders who are responsible for so much pollution currently happening on our planet. You've probably heard of a couple of these lovely big oil sponsors, like ExxonMobil, who sponsors Red Bull and was also historically a leader in climate denial from the 1980s to the 2000s. And you've probably heard of BP, which until recently sponsored Alpine and was of course also responsible for the Deepwater Horizon spill. But you might not have heard of Saudi Aramco, one of the biggest sponsors of the entire Formula One sport and literally one of the worst companies in the world. There's been a lot of buzz and news recently with Formula One declaring that they want to move the cars away from being fueled directly by oil and instead move on to more sustainable fuels. And that's led to many brands switching to e-fuels over petrol, which sounds like great news, right? Well, not according to the experts who say that e-fuels are a Trojan horse for continued fossil fuel usage. And they let big oil sports wash and lobby the EU for things in their interest under the name of Formula One. Also, despite these big public declarations of moving to e-fuels, Formula One's own reports show that most of the carbon emissions from the sport don't actually come from fueling the cars. In fact, the emissions from that particular part of the sport only account for 0.7% of the total. According to Formula One's own findings, of the 256,000 tons of carbon dioxide emitted in the 2019 season, 45% of it came from moving the cars around the globe to compete in the races, and 27% came from transporting the staff. The sport has acknowledged this as a problem and has been trying different ways to reduce that impact with varying success. But one area they're ramping up emissions rather than pulling back and not even bothering to put a sustainable spin on is fashion partnerships. Formula One has exploded in popularity recently, helped on by Drive to Survive turning the drivers into reality stars with their own thirst trap TikToks, and the new big Hollywood movie with Brad Pitt. The sport feels like it's had a PR overhaul, which has led to them attracting a new and younger female audience. The perfect audience for fashion collabs. And it feels like big oil is behind the scenes pulling a lot of the strings. After all, if they're already sharing separate beds with big fashion and big motorsport, then why not just have a menage a trois? But maybe we need to take a step back and look at the partnership that traditionally existed between big oil and big fashion. And it's a pretty simple relationship. Big oil destroys our planet by fracking for petroleum. Petroleum gets turned into fashion's favorite fabric, which is polyester. Brands buy this polyester and sell it more than any other fabric because it's cheap and because it's versatile. At the same time as releasing sustainability reports talking about how they need to reduce their impact on the planet, and therefore they create more demand for polyester, which means big oil increases fracking and the cycle goes round. That's just the main way big fashion props up big oil, and Stand.Earth did a great report on this if you want to learn more. But their research can be somewhat summed up by the following. The fashion industry is on track to become a major player in driving the expansion of fracking. Now, what all of that tells us is that the relationship between big oil and big fashion isn't new. But everything in the past was a little bit less covert than what's happening right now in front of our eyes. Fashion flaunting its new obsession with the drivers and the influencers and the lifestyle of Formula One, and only indirectly funding big oil by increasing the hype and overconsumerism around the sport they profit from, as well as, of course, continuing to sell more clothes and more polyester. They're so deep in bed at this point, it's not a trend, it's a cultural strategy. Since Drive to Survive came out in 2022, we've seen Formula One fever spreading all over fashion, mostly because female interest in the sport skyrocketed as a result. Cue the Chanel Cruise collection in 2023, featuring logo helmets and racing suits. Celebs being dressed in designer to visit the paddock, fast fashion brands bringing out collections covered in team logos and the general Formula One style. The Ferrari team getting a slot in Milan Fashion Week to show their new collection. Meanwhile, drivers and their partners have become a new breed of fashion influencer and movie star, and brands are aware they're paying just as much for the appeal of the lifestyle, the glamour, the yachts and the champagne as they are for the driver's face on their advert. Brands have done their research and know that female fans are more likely to be introduced to Formula One through lifestyle and social media content or through friends and family. So they're betting higher on social media campaigns featuring drivers, wags, lifestyle content around Formula One to capitalize on the purchasing power of TikTok. We're getting magazine edits and TikTok edits of what to wear to the races. Fashion influencers getting invited to the races by brands as like a community event, whilst also decked out in head-to-toe merch. Wags of the drivers seeing their following skyrocket and brands beating down their doors for sponsorship deals, as well as for the drivers themselves. And since the Formula One movie came out, all of this seems to have just exploded even further. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if we got some runway collections taking place on the tracks in the coming seasons, or fashion campaigns featuring the Formula One cars cropping up, because honestly, I don't think fashion can get enough of selling this lifestyle. We can't do a fashion and Formula One video without talking about one particular driver. And with the way Lewis Hamilton has been taking the fashion industry by storm, it could be its own video. But after so long being the fashionable poster boy for Formula One, it kind of makes sense why he's so in demand now. He went from being the first ever driver to attend the Met Gala to co-hosting it this year, as well as announcing a sponsorship deal with Lululemon, becoming an ambassador for Dior, and launching his own clothing line, Plus44. He's the OG fashionable driver. He's the blueprint for fashion and Formula One collabs. But I feel like it's gotten bigger than him now. Now, serious money is getting spent. And I mentioned earlier a major deal had taken place between a big fashion house and Formula One. It turns out Louis Vuitton wants to deepen their ties with the sport so much, they've just agreed to a 10-year partnership, moving from dressing the races as they come into the paddock to funding the races themselves. That kind of investment is not cheap, and it's the kind of money put into a sport funded directly by big oil that puts a line in the sand of where fashion's priorities lie in the future, in my opinion. And Formula One is not a passive partner here. I'm coining the phrase girly washing to describe how the teams have been partnering on matcha pop-ups and fashion and beauty events, all in an effort to go viral on TikTok and fund their big oil sponsored teams. Aston Martin confirmed that 80% of their Formula One revenue now comes from commercial partnerships. And jumping on the matcha pop-up trend feels very targeted towards female fans that historically they've been criticized for neglecting. Likewise, the amount of brands rushing to sponsor female racing now that they're building more of a fan base is very interesting. I mean, speaking of trends, let's talk about the elephant in the room and how this is impacting how we're dressing on TikTok. Because I do think Formula One chic, or like moto chic, is going to be a big trend in the next coming years if it hasn't already started infiltrating. Drive to Survive kind of sparked this a little bit, but I think now with the Hollywood movie, we're going to be seeing a lot of style in autumn reflecting this kind of like leather, bikey, grungy racing chic. I think logo heavy pieces, leather jackets, boiler suits, pops of quiet luxury styled with these things, and maybe just anything that goes viral enough in a TikTok edit of Formula One, especially if a Formula One wag is wearing it. And don't get me wrong, I actually really like the aesthetic of a logo leather jacket, but I think we need to talk about the deeper meaning of why fashion is buying into Formula One, not just to sell logo jackets for a season. We've talked quite a bit recently on this channel about how fashion is really into world building and lore building right now, and how a lot of that is to do with trying to fix their downturn in sales and customer loyalty. The Formula One trend fits into this so well, because not only is there a really great aesthetic that they can sell people on, it's also promising access to a lifestyle that's been quite exclusive and luxury based, and therefore out of touch for many. This in turn makes it a really easy target for overconsumptive and emotional spending rather than rational spending. There's definitely a pocket of the internet that will buy into a heavily logoed leather jacket, which is really polyester, if they think it also means they're gaining access to a world of fast cars and champagne and glamour. And of course, fashion and Formula One are going to take advantage of these feelings of wanting to belong and wanting to be in a community and use it to sell us more. Once again, we're back to talking about how hobbies and community have been weaponized by fashion and other industries to sell us things we don't need. And if that topic is interesting to you, then good news, I've done a couple of videos on it, so I'll pop them on screen. There was this really interesting article I read recently in BOF that kind of went into why fashion started losing its touch and why they're now in such a predicament of trying to build loyalty and status again. And I'll read a quote from it, but I have also done a video on this if you're interested. There's a whole deep dive. But the article said, whereas luxury once meant beautifully crafted objects, it became about storytelling. Instead of luxury goods, brands retooled to deliver luxury narratives. And as long as their products signaled luxury, they realized they could cut corners on quality to boost margins and meet growing demand without alienating shoppers. Obviously, that's all blown back in their faces, but I think it's a really good insight into how luxury lost its edge. But okay, I feel like we've gone a little bit off topic, so let's refocus right at the end here to go back to my original point for this video. I wanted to talk not really about the Formula One dressing trend and my predictions for how it's going to infiltrate fashion in the next few seasons, but fashion's obvious new tie to big oil and how this now represents a pattern and a line in the sand for me about where their priorities lie in terms of sustainability. So when those same brands that are now dressing drivers and funneling money into a sport backed by big oil and the worst polluters on the planet start to talk to us about their sustainability reports and how hard they've been working towards, cleaning up the fashion industry, their hypocrisy can become glaringly obvious to you. I have more thoughts on this, but I want to keep it short and sweet. So I'm going to call the video there. Let me know your thoughts and comments. Maybe I'll do a follow-up one or talk about it in the podcast. But thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe to the channel, follow me on Instagram if you want to, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.